Thank you very much for being here tonight. I do love Seattle, and it is great to be here. My wife, Carrie Brock, loved living and working here, and she sends her best to all her friends here. We do love the Northwest, and we love this cause, and we love the idea of this evening. But I must tell you in deeper truth that I came last year and I returned this year because Carrie and I, and like those of you in this room who know her, love Jill Bennett. And we admire her founding of Northwest Cancer Partners and her vision in creating this annual lecture. Now, Jill could not be here tonight, but she would want me to tell you that every one of the 320 seats here tonight has been sold out for a month, and she's very proud of that. She wanted me to say some things for her, and so I think the best is that I quote some of the things that she was going to say to you tonight. Jill says, because there are so many of you here tonight who were not with us a year ago, let me spend a brief moment telling you why Northwest Cancer Partners became my cause. My mother suffered from breast cancer. I am a cancer survivor, and there are more than 38 breast cancer survivors in this room here tonight. Jill says, it occurred to me as I considered the war that cancer declared on me and so many others, as I endured my occasional occurrences and recalibrations, that we really don't have to take it anymore without fighting back. And so Northwest Cancer Partners began in 2002 to fight back. And tonight we continue to fight back. You here in this audience are our special partners. You have grown in number by some 50% in a single year, and that's incredible growth. Northwest Cancer Partners, our mission, our mandate have grown, is growing, and because of you and for all that you have done, and I know will continue to do, our deepest, our heartfelt, our most sincere thanks. That's the end of Jill's quote. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Julie Graylow. No one has meant more to the initiatives by Northwest Cancer Partners to explore ways to enhance progress in fighting breast cancer than Dr. Graylow. She is a distinguished oncologist, a member of the faculty at the University of Washington School of Medicine, a member of the faculty at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and her practice is at the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. She has supported Northwest Cancer Partners' efforts to identify promising therapies that need financial support in order to have a chance of moving from the laboratory to clinical trials. And she is here to tell you what I believe will surely strike you as exciting possibilities. Dr. Graylow is Jill Bennett's doctor, and as Jill told me this afternoon, she is one of her best friends. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Julie Graylow.
Thanks, John. I'm one of many members of Jill's healthcare team. There are several other members here in the audience tonight. And it's unfortunate that Jill can't be here, but it really, I have to say, I agree with Jill on this, Greg, and not you. This is a little pebble on the road, and Jill's going to get through this. And we're going to look back on it and say just bad timing. And she's going to be with us next year and plan this, and John will come out next year. But I do think that what this drives home is the whole reason that Northwest Cancer Partners was started, and that is to help hasten the exciting research that's going on in the lab, get it into the clinic, and get it into patients like Jill in their lifetime, and make a difference in their lifetime, and not let it be 10, 20, 30 years before we get this so that we're curing cancer. So of course, Jill carefully choreographed my talk tonight, as well as everything else. And what I'm first supposed to do is tell you a little bit about what Northwest Cancer Partners is. This is the Northwest Cancer Partners logo, accelerating science to save lives. And Northwest Cancer Partners is dedicated to fostering collaboration among all of you, scientists, industry, survivors, and the community. One of the major initiatives of Northwest Cancer Partners is a research program, and the intent of that program is to speed the most promising cancer research discoveries into clinical trials, into real people. Additionally, the annual Mary Gates Lectureship, and you're at the second annual Mary Gates Lectureship and Banquet, promotes cancer education, awareness, and communication between all of these different groups. The first Mary Gates lecture was in 2003, and Dr. Rick Klausner, who is the former director of the National Cancer Institute, was our keynote speaker. In his talk last year, he told us that recently we've had an amazing explosion of knowledge, new approaches, and technologies in cancer research. We have had real progress in cancer prevention, detection, diagnosis, and treatment, and even more progress is imminently within our grasp. But he also told us that it's very true that a number of very promising therapies and new drugs never make it out of the laboratory into clinical trials. And he equated this as I-5 at rush hour, where you have 4 lanes getting down to 2 in the middle, and you've got this bottleneck between the laboratory and the clinic. And that's what Northwest Cancer Partners is trying to get past. Tonight, we're incredibly fortunate to have another amazing cancer researcher, Dr. Judah Folkman. The title of his talk is Beating Cancer at Its Own Game, Targeting Blood Vessel Growth in Preventing and Treating Cancer. Now, many of you in this room know Dr. Folkman, and some of you don't. And I'll tell you, I first heard of Dr. Folkman when I was in my training in Boston, and he gave a lecture in the Harvard Medical School, and he talked about this concept of tumors bringing in blood vessels to bring in their own nutrients. And you know, I have to admit, I was already thinking of going into oncology as a practice at that time, but his lecture really clinched it for me. I said, this is a fascinating area where we can combine important clinical care and important research and really make a difference in the world. And he's one of the major reasons that I went into oncology. Northwest Cancer Partners is bridging the gap. And this is Jill's slide, where she shows us what happens to research. It then gets translated, it's developed, we produce new therapies, we get it into the treatment stage, and we also help support patients. So this is the continuum of research within oncology. And what I'm here to describe tonight is 3 exciting projects that Northwest Cancer Partners has identified to help foster and to bring farther. We had a request for applications earlier in the year, and the Medical Advisory Committee reviewed those, and I will show you briefly the 3 projects that we will highlight tonight and that we are aiming to help bring from the laboratory into the clinic. The first is a project on anti-cancer immune therapy that Keith Knutson is leading. And the idea behind this project is to take our own immune system, our own natural defense system, and use it to target cancer. So we'll take a patient, and I was trying to draw a little hair on this to make it a woman for Jill, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. So we take a patient who has cancer and doesn't have an immune defense against it. So low numbers of cancer-targeting immune cells, T cells. And we'll take from the patient some blood and screen for immune cells that might have anti-cancer activity that are in low numbers and aren't activated. And then we'll select out for those special cells, we'll grow them up in the lab, and part of this proposal is a rapid 500-fold expansion of these specific T cells in the lab, outside the body. And then Dr. Knudsen will reinfuse them back into the patient. But now we've got a bunch of cells that are revved up to fight the cancer that are the patient's own cells. And after, we'll get high numbers of cancer-targeting T cells. And hopefully, that will make an impact. That's what this trial will test. And this is a picture of a cancer cell, that ugly looking cell with all of the little things coming out of it. And these are T cells homing in to the cancer cell. And this picture shows a tumor cell that's been killed by T cells. So this is what Dr. Knudsen's group hopes to accomplish through this very exciting project of taking the patient's own body and targeting the cancer. The second project is by Dr. David Hockenberry, and this is targeting resistant cancer cells in another very interesting novel way. So this picture depicts some cancer cells in pink and some normal cells that have the white background. And with normal cancer therapy that we call cytotoxic therapy, this would be chemotherapy, what we do is we kill off a bunch of sensitive cancer cells, but we also affect a lot of normal cells in the body. And what we end up with, in many cases, is we don't kill all the cancer cells. We're left with resistant cancer cells. And it happens that many of these resistant cancer cells have a certain survival protein called BCL-XL. So what Dr. Hockenberry's group is doing is they're taking targeted therapy, the slingshot here, and they have a BCL-XL targeted therapy called 2-methoxy-antimycin A that really gets these very resistant cells. And so by using this combination approach and targeting the most resistant cells, this is what we hope to achieve. Right now, this drug is in the laboratory, and the goal of this project, and what Northwest Cancer Partners hopes to do, is fund it to get out of the laboratory. The third project is a very interesting project looking at harnessing anti-cancer compounds from nature. So this compound that's called, right now, hopefully they'll come up with a catchier name for it if it works, PGC-K08. This is a compound that's been identified in Chinese herbs. And this is a picture of chai hu, and it's a medicinal plant used in Asia. And Dr. Kai Wang and his group have found the chemical structure for the active agent, the anti-cancer agent in chai hu. And what this drug, this PGC-K08, does is it binds to a very critical structure within a cancer cell, and it's called the microtubulin network. And what this microtubulin network does is it helps cells divide into two. And if you get cells that get all ready to divide, and they're sitting here, this is two cells that have reproduced their DNA, they're trying to divide, the cancer cell's trying to replicate. And if what you do is you put a block on it, and you prevent that cell division, you get these cells that are paralyzed in division, they can't go on and function, they can't go on and spread, and they will die. So that's what this compound does. And again, what Northwest Cancer Partners is hoping to highlight is this very exciting agent and moving it from the lab into clinical trials. So here's where Northwest Cancer Partners is with these three projects, and we will pick out other projects in years to come. And this is what Jill wanted me to do, was to describe the three projects and get you excited about what's going on here in the Northwest with research. And I just want to add my personal thanks to all of you for here for supporting this program. Thank you very much.
So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, the Mary Gates Lecturer, a distinguished cancer warrior, Dr. Judah Folkman, professor of pediatric surgery at Boston's Children's Hospital and at Harvard Medical School, a surgeon, an oncologist, a researcher whose work and discovery and entire professional life serve as an inspiration to those healthcare professionals who dedicate their lives to saving lives of cancer victims. As I read the news stories that recounted his phenomenal career of achievements, it seemed to me that he was the perfect choice to come here tonight and tell this audience about, as Julie said, beating cancer at its own game. We simply could not welcome a speaker here whose life and career more perfectly inspire and complement the dreams and goals of this partnership. No one anywhere can understand better than he the emotional highs that come to a surgeon when a procedure saves just one life, or cures just one illness, or eases the pain of just one patient. And No one anywhere can appreciate better than he the frustration that comes from the long and thankless years of research, years of investing time and talent and energy in pursuit of discovery that has the potential and promise, but at the same time never knowing until the moment of discovery that there suddenly is the prospect of saving not just one life, but thousands of lives, curing many illnesses, easing the pain, saving so many who are suffering. As a research scientist, Dr. Folkman has known that frustration. He has endured the doubts of skeptics, the questions of critics, the challenges of peer review. He has also known the elation of discovery. As Julie described to you, Dr. Folkman formulated the theory he called angiogenesis and worked to create a process of anti-angiogenesis, a theory that blood vessels nurtured tumors and that without blood to feed them, tumors would not grow. Years after those skeptics scoffed at the thought that he was onto something monumental, today that promise holds out hope for a new generation of cancer patients. And I think you understand now why he is the natural choice to deliver this lecture. His has been a phenomenal career. So for all his skill and for all his work and for all his faith and for all his life means to the lives of so many others, I am very proud to present to you the Northwest Cancer Partners 2004 Mary Gates Lecturer, Dr. Judah Folkman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Siegenthaler, ladies and gentlemen. I am very honored to be the second Mary Gates lecturer, and especially to follow in the footsteps of Richard Klausner. I especially thank Jill Bennett for the invitation and for organizing all of this, and I thank the Northwest Cancer Partners. However, whenever I speak after dinner, I always follow my wife's advice. Paula says, no matter how short your talk is after you have it all written out, cut it by 1/3. I tell her that her entreaty always reminds me of the story of the famous Russian author Dostoevsky, who received the following letter from his publisher. Thank you for the draft of your new book. We think it will be a great classic, but it's too long. We cannot publish it unless you cut it by 1/3. Therefore, we are returning your manuscript entitled Crime, Punishment, and Redemption. Therefore, this will be a truncated talk on a very large field called angiogenesis research. Angiogenesis means the growth of new blood vessels. These are fine blood vessels, thinner than a hair, that travel to all organs of the body, and in fact there are miles of them. A pound of fat, it has been learned, contains 1 mile of capillary tubing. And if you have high blood pressure, your doctor will ask you to lose some weight. And that means that you're losing miles of tubing that the heart doesn't have to pump through, and so the pressure comes down. And this has really been worked out very carefully. Now, these capillary blood vessels, miles of them in the body, normally are not growing. They grow only for a few days during the menstrual period in ovulation, then they stop, 4 days. And after an operation in a wound, they grow for 14 days and then stop, 15 days. But in tumors, at a certain point when a tumor is a little bigger than a pinhead, where it will stop for years, and then suddenly a few of them will switch on angiogenesis, the blood vessel growth never stops. There's been almost no evidence that it can stop by itself. So we started some experiments in the late 60s and tried to get a paper published, but we couldn't get it published till 1971, and it was in the New England Journal. And it said, we have some evidence that tumors are angiogenesis dependent. That is, that they have to grow or recruit their own private blood supply. And we proposed in this paper that someday there would be angiogenesis inhibitors. And I thought the field would really take off after this. But nothing happened for 10 years. And the reason is that no one anywhere, including at Harvard, believed that tumors needed new blood vessels, nor that they could stimulate them, nor that it was even worth stopping the blood vessels, because they said it's like stopping pus in a wound. It's a side effect in an infected wound. And so in 1971, you see there were 3 papers in the world literature with angiogenesis in the title, 2 from our lab and 1 criticizing a former paper of ours. And that ratio held up for a decade. And so we could work without any competitors. In fact, all of our ideas were theft-proof. And then by 1981, we actually had the first protein that a tumor could make, and it would stimulate blood vessels. And then some competitors came in. Critics converted to competitors gradually. And today, 17,000 papers later, with 1,000 labs in the world, there are 50 papers every week with angiogenesis, and they range from cancer to beyond. Now, it turns out that cancer doesn't always start out angiogenic. Most of us have the non-angiogenic form. How do we know this? It comes from auto accidents. Around the world, there are 1.5 million deaths every year from automobile accidents. And in Europe, in many countries, autopsy is mandatory. In the US, it is up to the medical examiner. And in these autopsies, pathologists note that they find small cancers in situ, pinhead size, in most every organ, and they write papers which are never cited. And there are thousands of these papers saying we found this early cancer in situ, meaning in place, never goes anywhere, harmless. And then in 1993, 2 professors of epidemiology at Dartmouth, Professors Black and Welch, collected all these and put them in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I show you just 3 organs out of all the others. And they said that women over 40 who died in an auto accident or of trauma, who never had cancer in their life, 39% had small carcinomas in their breast. Pinhead, 0.5 millimeter, a millimeter, but only 1 out of 100 would ever have cancer in their lifetime. The other 99, protected. For men with in the prostate, 46%, but only 1 out of 100 would ever have it in their lifetime, even if they live to 100. Those are the statistics. And the biggest shock was that in the thyroid gland of Europeans, Canadians, Americans, and South Americans, 98% or more have 1 or more cancer of the thyroid, papillary cancer, in situ. But the other surprise was that only 1 out of 1,000 of us ever would have it in their lifetime. This paper seemed to have no effect, because when I called in 1993 for reprints, this was before internet, they said we still have all the reprints. How many do you want? So I said, I'm teaching a class, 1 per student. And then I got the paper and began to go through the references and wrote a letter to each of the pathologists, and they sent slides. Here's a glass slide the size of your finger. This is what a pathologist looked like to see the tissue. And then I would work with our pathologists at the Brigham and Women, and that little dot, which is 0.5 millimeter, that's less than a pinhead, is the early cancer in situ. And every once in a while you would see a big one. So 0.5 millimeters, a pencil tip is 1.5 millimeters, 0.5 millimeters. And here's a big one. Every once in a while somebody died with one that's almost 4.8 millimeters, but they died, you don't know what would happen. However, when we stained these slides to look for blood vessels, here's this tiny little tumor that's only 0.5 millimeter, that's a pinhead. And the brown stain are the blood vessels, and they're outside, but there's almost no blood vessels inside. But in contrast, the large tumors were loaded with blood vessels, every follicle. This is just 4.8 millimeters. The cancer is off the screen. There's a huge draining vein. This tumor has turned on its angiogenesis, and if the patient had lived, might have developed one of these tumors. So in summary of that paper, most of the population has these tiny in situ carcinomas, and they're dividing and dying in place. They're just harmless, but they have not yet switched on the capacity to bring in blood vessels. And then a few of us have these, and those are the cancers, of course, that are being treated. And it's not just in patients who died. You can see it in patients live patients from biopsy. So in the normal breast, there are about 10,000 or so small tubes, ducts, pencil tip size, which drain to 7 major ducts, which drain to the nipple. Helen Jensen's work in Chicago. And the inside lining cells never really divide. They're resting. But if they start to become tumors, they fill up this hollow space called the lumen. And that's cancer in situ. And that's what was found in these in auto accidents. But that's harmless. But 1 out of 100 will switch on and start to recruit blood vessels, and that permits rapid growth over many years. And this is a 1 centimeter tumor. It would have 1 billion cells. You might pick it up on a mammogram pretty easily. You might even feel it by palpation. But those cells now start to leave the main tumor daily, entering the bloodstream and circulating, and a few then become metastasis, changing places. And you can actually see that. So here's the normal duct here, and here's the earliest cancer you would ever see. And these brown stained cells, they're low power and sort of blurry, but they are endothelial cells being recruited, and they've come crashing against a cellophane-like membrane called the base membrane, and they can't get through. It is full of one of the angiogenesis inhibitors that has been discovered in the body called endostatin, and it sort of guards that. But then if time goes on, you now see that when the tumors stimulate these endothelial cells, they stimulate the endothelial cells to make enzymes. And one of these enzymes, metalloproteinase family, allows the vessels to invade right through the base membrane and come in. And this is about 100 little tiny capillaries. And now the tumor escapes out through the breach. And it goes into the soft tissue of the breast. And now you have this rapidly growing tumor. Each of these brown staining capillary vessels is supporting a little family of tumor cells. Each endothelial cell supports about 50 to 100 tumor cells. Here it is at very high power. So now you see, this is work from Donald McDonald. You can see, in fact, this is breast cancer. But the blood vessels are being perfused with a solution in the specimen to keep them open. That's a capillary thinner than a hair, layers of tumor cell around it. And if you look here, here's the next neighborhood, because at this point they run out of oxygen. Now they surround this capillary and this one and this one. New sprouts are growing. And the interesting thing is, if I showed you brain tumor, pancreatic cancer, prostate, colon cancer, at this power it looks the same. Once the tumors have started to bring in these blood vessels, they don't stop and they grow around them. Here, in fact, we overlay the tumor cells by electron microscopy. Here are the endothelial cells dividing for the first time in their long existence. They rarely divide. They're being forced to divide and grow these tubes with blood in them, and the tumor cells are sitting out here living on that, all the oxygen. And the tumor cells also make the vessels very leaky, the reason the brain tumors swell, the reason for edema in the arm, the reason for ascites in ovarian cancer, the reason for swollen legs, all of the edema. And here at lower power you see a sarcoma. It's just a different kind of tumor. It's a pencil eraser size, 4 millimeters. Only the previous week had it begun to switch. You see the normal capillaries look like the streets of a city, at least New York. And then these new vessels are just coming in all the time, and that's the angiogenic switch, a very dangerous step. And patients can tell you the clinical sign: blood in the urine, bladder cancer if it's there, blood in the sputum if there's lung cancer, blood in the stool if there's colon cancer, and so forth. So to make a long story short, years of work, we now know that tumors recruit their own blood supply, grow around them, and then send cells in. And the biggest surprise has been in the past few years, mainly from Canadian researchers. Once the endothelial cells are stimulated, the endothelial cells contribute back and give growth factors to the tumor and survival factors. So when the patient sees the bleeding, things have now started to get worse. So to summarize, years of work. Most of us have in situ tumor, which are harmless. Very few, 1 out of 1,000, switch to the angiogenic state. That allows the tumor to expand and to grow, and then to grow metastases. So I don't know how many here are the physicians who teach medical students, but if you teach at Harvard Medical School in an amphitheater of 180 students, in the front row sit the type A, straight A, super compulsive summas with their keys left over from college, Phi Beta Kappa. So you get 5 minutes into the lecture and the hands go up. How do you know that? What's the reference for that? Do we have to know that on the exam? So my colleagues and I carry defensive slides. About every 5th slide has all the references for what I said. Now you may notice that we've put it in small font. Only the front row can read it because nobody else seems to care. So what this says is that all cancer today is treated years after the angiogenic switch, 5, 10 years after the angiogenic switch, whether you treat it with chemotherapy or radiotherapy or immunotherapy or now anti-angiogenic therapy. It's after the angiogenic switch. And you say, well, why could we treat it before or much earlier? And now we have 30 angiogenesis inhibitors in clinical trial in the US, 4 FDA approved, 70 worldwide, a gathering industry that's quite large, and they're all trying to catch up with Genentech, and I don't own any stocks in Genentech, although my wife wonders why. But the point of it is that they're now a leader in angiogenesis research, and other companies have paid attention. So that's important. There are 2 great classes. On your left are those molecules which are pure angiogenesis inhibitors. That's all they do. That's what they do. They stop blood vessel growth mainly in tumors. Avastin is the most recent one approved. It stops an angiogenic stimulator. On the right are drugs which were, many of them approved for another function, like Celebrex, approved by the FDA for arthritis. And then new science later showed it's a powerful angiogenesis inhibitor, and it stops blood vessels from destroying cartilage. So science goes sometimes forward and sometimes slow and sometimes fast. Look at aspirin. How come with a drug that's 100 years old we're still finding mechanisms of it? It's not because scientists were taking, months off. Now here, this in our particular lab, this doesn't have the date didn't come through, but it's February 26th. It's a banner day a few months ago, and this appeared on the internet from Genentech. The day that the FDA approved their drug. And notice that it says a first-line treatment for metastatic colon cancer. There's 1 death from colon cancer every 9 minutes worldwide. And this is a very good drug. The clinical trials were really outstanding. And it's given every 3 weeks, and it doesn't have hardly any side effects. Your bone marrow is protected, you don't lose your hair, and so forth. So it's a new kind of modality. And immediately, while it was still in clinical trial, the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and many others in the country began to use it. So here is a study which they are advertising in their quarterly review. We work closely with the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Women who have breast cancer who have failed everything, failed tamoxifen, failed Taxol, failed everything, who are very, very sick, go on Avastin plus low-dose chemotherapy called metronomic cyclophosphamide, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams every day. Those 2 are anti-angiogenic, but they are not toxic. And so this is Harold Burstein's very exciting trial. Now the other unexpected thing was that in macular degeneration, which affects 11 million Americans, and 2 million are already blind, from blood vessels bleeding, growing in the back of the eye, over about age 60 it starts. And there have been no drugs, no treatment at all. The biggest surprise of all is that Avastin works perfectly there. All you have to do is, it's given locally now because the FDA wanted it that way, and it's the same molecule, almost the same molecule. The tumors are using vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF, and then they add other ones, but the eye overexpresses VEGF, and it's VEGF all the way, and Avastin stops that. And so Genentech, you can see the vessels here, and you can see them coming here, growing up behind the retina, and they bleed, and you lose your sight. And in a very clever business strategy, they changed the name to Lucentis. But what's very interesting, is they did that, of course, so it wouldn't be mixed up. But it means that there's a common theme here. Once you understand how blood vessels grow, you can understand different angiogenesis-dependent diseases. And this is very exciting because it's in phase 3. There are two other companies. Pfizer has one that's competing, which is good because 11 million patients, one company couldn't handle it. Alcon has a third one, also phase 3. And in this particular study presented earlier last year, they showed that a certain percent of the patients actually who had severe sight deficiency after a couple months on the drug could read down the eye chart 3 lines and sign a check, and a couple could drive a car. That is important because the textbooks say that the dogma is once you're blind from macular degeneration, it is irreversible. That changed this year. Now, what's very interesting is sometimes old drugs have new functions. So thalidomide was, in Germany in 1960s, was one of the best sedatives there was because you could not overdose yourself. It was designed so you could not take an overdose. And if you, the sleeping dose was 100 milligrams. If you took 5,000 milligrams, you wake up 5 days later. And then it was found to be the best drug there is for morning sickness. And women who took a single pill once in the first 60 days of pregnancy, depending on which day the baby had a short jaw, short arms, short legs, it was immediately stopped. After 60 days, it made no difference. You didn't have any problems. That puzzle stayed. The company closed it all out, and but it was used in this country for leprosy, and it's also used for graft versus host disease in children with some of the leukemias. And Robert D'Amato, who's an MD, PhD, brilliant, intuitive ophthalmologist in our lab, looking for some way to treat macular degeneration before these drugs, said, what kind of drug that you could take one pill would stop bone formation, muscle formation altogether? Must be an angiogenesis inhibitor. And this is his famous paper, which has now, in fact, helped he's now being promoted to professor, which is no small thing at Harvard because more people die waiting for tenure than liver transplants. And thalidomide is cheap to make, and it's gone very fast. And it's the #1 drug for multiple myeloma and for other solid tumors. Even this slide is out of date. It's 130,000 patients. Many have been on 5 years. I have a classmate, a professor of medicine, who's gone public, Chase Peterson, used to be the president of University of Utah. From the day he started 5 years ago, his bones have healed up in multiple myeloma, and he's fine. And he tried to stop it to see what would happen, and the disease came back, so he started it. And then he has reported himself as a single case report. Now, here's another, this is a single case out of a large series of 2,000 patients. Mark Kieran at the Dana-Farber is running this, but this was one of the first children with brain tumor which failed radiotherapy, so it is, so the child was terminally ill. And so there's a trial for patients who have failed everything, all ages, with 3 approved angiogenesis inhibitor drugs. Celebrex, approved drug, thalidomide's compassionate approved, and low-dose Cytoxan, 20-year-old drug, very low, all 3 put together. And about a third of these patients have a regression, a third stable and a third fail. But this is one of the early ones where the tumors regress completely, and she's still doing well. And because after the first year, when they opened this study, the brain tumor results were so good in adults and children that this study has now gone into about 300 medical centers through the various cooperative groups. And in December, Australia was the first country to approve it, and they said, quote, the best treatment in the past 25 years. This is from the chair of the United Kingdom Myeloma Committee. So D'Amato, we're using this to defend for his promotion. When you go to get a promotion in Harvard, it's it's like going to court. So this raised the question. Well, I can tell you that we have a brilliant chemist named Yuan Qing, and he and I wrote together, and we discovered FGF and wrote angiostatin and all these others. And he did the chemistry, and I did the biology, and we wrote these papers. So he comes up for associate professor, and he's turned down. They said he's not independent. Folkman's on the paper. I go to the chief of the Department of Biochemistry, Chris Walsh, and he says, give me the file. Professor Walsh goes to the committee and says, I do not have to prove that Qing is independent. I only have to prove that Folkman is not a biochemist. And that'll just take 2 minutes. So life in Boston goes on. Now, once you have non-toxic drugs, for example, endostatin has no side effects, and we have patients on it 2 and 3 years. you can now begin to think, if you don't have side effects or have very low level like Avastin, could you treat earlier? Could you just start to treat really early? And that question, as I showed in the lecture at the Huts this morning, came from a patient. So this patient comes from London, and when he was 13, he had a special type of cancer of the thyroid called medullary cancer of the thyroid, which has its own biomarker, the single best biomarker in medicine. It's called calcitonin. We all have it at about 100 picograms per mil or less, and it just sits there. And if it starts to rise month after month, year after year, up to 8,000, when it passes about 6,000 or 8,000, you will have a medullary cancer of the thyroid. It's specific, it's sensitive. The test is wonderful. The people here working on biomarkers at the Hutch and others hope that they would have something that's good. This is the gold standard. 7 to 10 years it forecasts. Now, so his tumor was taken out age 13. Now here he is. This is 7 years here. They come every 2 years from London. The father's a distinguished physicist. He's graphed the rise in logs here. And he says, look, we know, his doctors say, within about 3 to 4 years from this date, which is now this year, it will recur in the chest, as they almost always do. The radiotherapist will treat it, and only 20% will survive. It's a terrible tumor. So the father, 2 years ago, said, look, I want you to treat the blood test. You choose any combination of angiogenesis inhibitors, Celebrex, Avastin, endostatin, angiostatin. Treat the blood test till it comes down. And then we'll never see the tumor, and I don't want to see it. So when I went to get permission from the FDA, they thought that was a good idea, but the internal review boards at various hospitals said, you cannot treat a tumor that you cannot see. Okay? Well, that's current thinking. But I'm telling you it's going to change very quickly because we have some competition now that we started to present this. And MD Anderson is moving ahead on 3 patients. And so our group has said, well, they can't do that. And so anyhow, in the usual general medical competition. But what's extraordinary is that what if you did, let's say you try 2 drugs and they're non-toxic and it doesn't come down. You try some more. You have 4 more years, 3 or 4 more years, and then it comes down. Now it comes down, you can't publish it. Who's going to believe that there ever was a tumor? But if you do it 100 times, then it will. And so the father said, I implore you to treat the blood test. And that is the history of infection. Before 1930, you always located the abscess and drained it. After 1941, you treat the blood test. So you never know. So we have this now, and we always treat long after the angiogenic switch. But the danger is this. If you wait that long, 60% of patients who first have a breast tumor, the tumor makes only VEGF. 60% of patients walking in with a first lump. But as time goes on, 3 years pass, and now a recurrence, and now they're making 3 angiogenic factors. In the last 2 years of life, making 6 angiogenic factors. Really hard to treat, and the tumor is really growing fast. So one would like to treat far back of this so you don't get through these mutations. These are mistakes in copying. They're actually like typographical errors. So we said, why couldn't we treat very, very early, long before, years before, like that calcitonin patient? And in fact, those are the experiments going on now. And one of the interesting things is that over the years, angiogenesis inhibitors have not only been discovered in companies, but they've been discovered also in the body, mainly by university scientists. And there are now 14 of them known, and they're being discovered at a fairly good rate. For the clotting system, which works with the angiogenesis system, there are 45. And that's slowed down now, so we don't know how many there will be. But these are natural angiogenesis inhibitors that defend against angiogenesis. How do we know? If you take out anyone, like you take out tumstatin in animals, tumors grow 300% faster. So the tumors we think were growing at ceiling rate are damped. They're damped by your own angiogenesis inhibitors. And my favorite one of all of these is endostatin. And the reason is that 1, it's 600 million years old. It's all the way down to worms. And 2, there's some surprising papers. When I was in medical school in 1953 at Harvard, I have my notes. It says, down patients do not get cancer. Answer in the exam was, they don't live long enough. 1953. Now they live till 60 or 70. There are papers like this throughout the literature. 17,800 American Downs, age matched, no breast cancer, no colon, no prostate, 1 case of pancreatic cancer in the world, no brain tumors, testicular cancer at the same rate as the rest of us, a mild leukemia when they're born, and 5% become blast form and they can't treat them. Why is that? When these papers came out, students would ask the professors, why is that? And the professors would say, are there some professors here? We see this. Well, if you have tenure, you know, you got to say something. So, so nobody knew until this paper came out from Bjorn Olsen at Harvard and Maria Passos Bueno, who's now become very famous. She's in Sao Paulo. She's a professor of genetics. She has a large collection of 2,000 Down patients in her practice, and they found that the Down patients have 50% more endostatin than all the rest of us because they have an extra copy of the protein from which it comes, collagen 18, on chromosome 21. So they're walking around loaded with endostatin, not anywhere near the therapeutic level that you would need to bring down a tumor, but it looks like they may protect against the tumor. Now that's a correlation. So, but that's how you start, circumstantial evidence. But then the testicular cancer has been explained now also. Endostatin doesn't seem to work on that. And the biggest surprise, when you go and look up all the papers on Downs, you push a button on PubMed, 13,000 papers come out. So we called all the postdocs together and we started to read them. And 2 things come out. They have the same amount of diabetes as all the rest of us, but no blood vessels in the eye. Not a single case of diabetic retinopathy. And all the ophthalmologists say, we could have told you that. So I say, why didn't you? Well, you never asked. It's incredible. And atheromas, which are growing in the coronaries, are angiogenesis dependent, and they don't have these either. And endostatin was discovered as inside of collagen 18 by Mike O'Reilly in the lab. And now there are many, many papers on it. But originally, it was very hard to reproduce it because we made it in bacteria. And so when you mailed the protein, it would aggregate, and you couldn't get it to work. And then after the first year, we made it in yeast, and it works beautifully. And now there are 80 labs that make their own, and all these different tumors were published that could be treated. And then came the discovery by several scientists that Celebrex is an angiogenesis inhibitor, a big surprise on the radar of angiogenesis research. And we didn't even believe it. But we tested it, and these are mice that are anesthetized, and you put a pellet of angiogenic protein, FGF. Vessels come up in 6 days, but if you feed them Celebrex before or after, you can prevent or regress the vessels, and it's a good angiogenesis inhibitor. And it was assumed that this was due to cyclooxygenase because Celebrex is a COX-2 cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor. But then came 3 papers that said it's still, Celebrex still inhibits angiogenesis in cyclooxygenase 2 knockout mice. That roiled up the field. It's against the beliefs. People say, I just don't believe that. But there was the data. Except that one scientist, Louis Ignaro, and his postdocs said, there's an anomaly, we better study it. And they found when you take Celebrex, your endostatin goes up just about to where the Downs are. Now that caused huge excitement in our lab and some consternation. Endostatin is our protein. We discovered it. We should have discovered this. Secondly, Louis Ignaro won the Nobel Prize in 1998 for nitric oxide. I had thought he was retired and very relaxed. But he's moved with his entire lab into our field. It's like seeing a division-strength army coming over the hill. And they did this very quickly, and this is very, very important because it's for the first time said that you can take a pill that can raise the level of your own inhibitor. And some people have low and some people have high. We know many prostate cancer patients have defective endostatin and so forth. And so when the Wall Street Journal published this piece showing that 50% of patients from colon cancer families are protected by Celebrex, they just didn't know about the endostatin. But there it is, preventing cancer, beginning to think about preventing it. And so we said if the prevention of the angiogenic switch in patients at high risk for cancer will require prolonged therapy with non-toxic angiogenesis inhibitors, endostatin is one, have we learned anything from the patients who have been on 2 years or more? So I'm going to show you a few patients, each of whom have insisted that they be shown, and I'll tell you the reason in 1 minute. So here is a young man who has metastatic cancer of the islet cells of the pancreas to the liver, failed all therapy. He used to weigh about 80 pounds, and he's been on endostatin at this time for a year and 2 months, self-injected at home. It's non-toxic protein, and he's showing off for the Boston Globe because he ran the marathon. He actually had good time in the Boston Marathon. Here he is this year. So now he's at his 2-year anniversary, and he decided not to run the marathon this year because he's getting married. And before, he decided he wouldn't be able to get married. And the day that he decided not to run it, the temperature was 95 degrees. So I said, you really are a fantastic advisor. Here's a man with carcinoid. It's a tumor in the intestine, and he's been treated for 2 years, and all the diarrhea has stopped. Now, these kinds of tumors were the most sensitive because when you start clinical trials, you must start at low doses. They were the first one to respond to the lowest dose, so they're out the longest. And here's a lady who cleans houses for a living, used to weigh about 70 or 80 pounds, had the metastatic carcinoid, and it's slowly going down. Notice it's 15% regression per year. Everything's in slow motion, but she doesn't care because she feels well. And notice that they also are all a little bit overweight. So we thought endostatin causes weight gain. And I talked to the patients. Nobody had ever asked them, why are you overweight? You don't understand. When you go to the office and you weigh 80 pounds, nobody makes eye contact, and they don't ask your opinion. And now when you come back and you're really heavy, they say, what do you think? And nobody ever asked what happened, where you were. And so they come up to the lab to visit at their 2-year mark, and this lady is advertised at the Dana-Farber because of the endostatin trials. But the data managers take an interview, which is in a chart, but it's never published in the abstracts, and says, I love the drug. I began to feel better about a month later. I no longer have the flushing. I play 18 holes of golf on the weekend. She's a head nurse at a local hospital, and now she came for her 2-year anniversary. They come visit the lab, and it's terrific feedback for the basic scientists. Now, why do I show these? Because in March, Fortune published this terrific article on the cancer war, and it said in a little box, endostatin, after a flurry of early hype, this first of many compounds designed to fight tumor angiogenesis, failed dramatically in human tests. The jury is still out as the next generation kid. Calls came in from all the endostatin patients in Boston, San Francisco, Europe. What kind of journalism is this? They said, so what actually happened? And we found out. And the point is, we're still on chemotherapy language. All the abstracts that have been written, the writer simply looked up the abstracts presented at ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. So if you give adriamycin or cisplatin and you get a complete tumor shrinkage, that's called complete response. If you get 50% shrinkage, it's called partial response. If you get 48% shrinkage, it's called no response. Why? Because if that's all you can do with a chemotherapeutic drug, get less than 50%, the tumor is going to come right back. So it's called no response. And stable disease is considered a failure. But in anti-angiogenic therapy, all the abstracts said no response because they had to follow the rule or they wouldn't be accepted. We haven't been able to get a new language yet through the FDA, even though the drugs are new. Finally, it turns out that Celebrex is not the only small drug. You can take other small ones that raise your endostatin level. And because of that, we wrote a paper in Nature just a month ago called Cancer Without Dis-ease. And we outline where this field may be going. Non-toxic drugs coming, biomarkers coming. When they intersect, you'll be able to treat the blood test. And first starting with breast cancer patients with a mutated breast cancer gene. So we're beginning to plan already that might be possible, that calcitonin may be a great biomarker for medullary cancer, that after patients are operated on for colon cancer, 50% are cured, but 50% get liver metastases. Could you treat the other half? And finally, could you prevent the angiogenic switch in brain tumors 10 years before? Because many of them have a seizure that tells you that it's coming. And last week, the National Institutes of Health announced a new program. The National Institutes of Health is based on diseases. Cancer Institute, Heart Institute, Eye Institute, arthritis, stroke, disease-based. But each institute is receiving so many grants in angiogenesis because it's such a unifying theme that they decided to put a new program together called Trans-Institute Angiogenesis Research Program. And if you're in Washington, that means TARP, TARP, everything's initial. And, but all these institutes met and their leaders, and it's extraordinary because what's happening in diabetes in the eye and macular degeneration and arthritis, this is going across these different fields. So I learned an enormous lesson about the commonality. Then I learned one other lesson that I must tell you about. So our daughter and her husband and our 4-year-old granddaughter live in Menlo Park, California. We get to visit every once in a while. And when our granddaughter was 2.5 years old, I was reading her a bedtime story, and she said, "Grandpa, when are you going to teach me how to read?" And I said, let's start tomorrow. And I was amazed at how fast she was going, because she thinks this is volume 2 of a catalog on angiogenesis. She thinks it's for 2-year-old readers. And she loves the pictures of the blue veins and the red arteries, and she traces them over, and she will not let go. This is under her pillow. This is Grandpa's book, still today. So we were visiting just this spring, which is 3.5. And she goes to preschool, and she's very pretty, boastful grandfather, and she has a couple of boyfriends, but Max is her favorite. And Max is 4. And she told Max, showing him the book, I am going to be a doctor like my grandpa. And Max said, only boys can be doctors, girls have to be nurses. At first I thought that may be just Menlo Park, but it's more common. And she came home in tears. And so I sent an email to my office. The next morning came back a picture of last year's Harvard Medical School graduating class, more than 50% women. I said, give this to Max, okay? So, and she comes home the next afternoon beaming. What did Max say? Nothing. He didn't say anything. I said, well, he must have changed his mind. And she was very quiet, and at the end of dinner she looks up, Grandpa, how come boys don't know stuff? So we're all learning together, and we're learning, in fact, that the ophthalmologist who's trying to stop blood vessel growth in the eye is dealing with the same process and the same drugs as the rheumatologist who's trying to stop blood vessel growth in the joints, as the oncologist who's trying to stop blood vessel growth in tumors, as the gynecologist who's trying to stop endometriosis, as the cardiologist who's trying to inhibit angiogenesis in plaques. So what is the take-home message? If you should drain the Pacific Ocean, you should not be surprised that the islands are connected. Thank you very much for the honor of this lecture.